Welcome to Lesson 4 of PSRM Fundamentals Overview. Here we'll be looking at the registration form. We'll be introducing you to the registration form, describing its life cycle, looking at the form type and the rules and sections and lines which make up the configuration needed for the form. We'll be specifically using a business registration form to create the similar entities that we did in lesson 3. Methods to register a taxpayer. In the previous lesson, we saw that you could manually set up a person, an account, and a tax roll using the PSRM pages, but there is a more useful and standard way to do that, and that is using a registration form. For businesses, we often use registration forms to create the standard entities needed for the registration, and then only after we have registered for the business, then we can use a tax form to add on the the assessments and the other financial transactions. Some forms you can actually use a tax. Sometimes you can actually use a tax form itself to generate all those registration entities as well as the assessment and other financial transactions all in one go. So in fact, there are actually 3 methods of doing it: manually, registration form to create the taxpayer, or the tax form itself can create the taxpayer as well. So we're going to start by looking at a registration form, and we're going to fill it out, and we'll see that we're going to create a person, account, tax roll, and obligation. And then after we do that, we will look at the life cycle of the registration form. So the first thing that we're going to do is go to the application, and we're going to go to Forms. I'm going to click on Add Registration Form. And we're going to see what we see that we have 3 different sections. A main section, which asks us the source of the form, and this actually might come in automatically from another system which is uploaded, and we'll see at the end that there is a whole upload staging entity which can take the forms and transform them into the format that is needed, and then add them into the system. But we're going to do it manually. We'll do online data entry. Here, document locator is a unique identifier for this particular form. I'm going to put my initials and start with 300. I'm going to use a receive date of today, and then I'm going to have 2 other sections that I'm going to fill out. And some of these are required fields, some are not. We can always use this button over here, check form, to see what is required for us to fill out. It will tell us that we need to fill out the taxpayer info is missing. So what I'm going to do is use the same type of name that we had before. We use store AAA. I'm going to use store BBB, and we're going to add in an address for, I don't know. And what we will see once we've completed this whole process, that all those entities that we created manually in the earlier lesson, last lesson, will be created now. We don't have to fill in address to county. I'm going to put in a city, let's say New York, state New York, just making something up. And again, here I'm going to add in my employee identifier for my store. I'm going to start with that. Remember, that's the format that is expected. Let me check form now and see if there's still if it says form has been verified successfully. But I do want to fill in also other information like the tax type. I'm going to have a tax. I also want to have a tax roll, so I'm going to add a sales and use. So I'm going to actually start this at the beginning of the year 2014, an industry code of say retail. I'm going to save that. So now I have a registration form which I filled in. I can edit it if I make a mistake. I can edit. In fact, I'm going to just show you if I actually decide that, let's say I don't need that. Let's see. It says a postal is C. That's what happens. So I need it. I need a postal for that. But let's say if I don't know. Let's see what happens. Let's say if I don't put it in the right format. Let me do that for a second. As I hit validate, as I go through, the registration form is going to complain here. Showing me that the format is not correct. It's placed it in the suspense state. And if I actually look, it will show in highlight in red where the problem is. Now if I actually, I did that specially because I wanted to see what a mistake would look like. Now I'm going to correct it back to how it was initially. I'm going to save that. Now the mistake, the error does not actually go away until, and it says it actually might be out of date until I hit validate again. And now you see that it's been successfully moved to the next status, which is ready for posting. And I can actually post it. And posting will basically add and create the entities that from the filled out information from the tax form, it should create a person for this business name, create an address, create an account linked to it, and also create a tax roll. And tax roll should also create obligations. So let's see what happens when I hit post. So we see now that on the main tab, the person just created has been shown as store BB. The count is there. Context has also been updated. So let's see what happens if I actually go to the person. You see that we have the business type person, we have the employer ID, the address that we created is there. We also see, if we go to the, let's see, the tax roll has been created. And there's the tax roll. And you immediately see that we have the tax roll with the industry code and the 4 obligations like previously. So this registration form replicates basically exactly what we did manually by filling in the different entities. Let's go back to the tax form now. Again, it's not a tax form, it's the registration form, I mean. And let's just have a look at the different tabs that are on offer on a registration form. We have exceptions. Now, if you remember, we did get an error at one time, and it actually shows me the history of all the errors when I created the form. It actually tells me what happened to it, if its status is closed, because we fixed it, if you remember. It tells me where it actually came from, who checked for it, something called a form rule. We're going to look at that later on when we look at how the form configuration and the form type is created. But just for now, we see that we do have a history of all exceptions. Now, interesting, we have something called a version. We have versions basically means any time that we save a version of the particular registration form, we do get a copy. So we got the original copy shown here. This was remember this copy we had when we saved without the ID number in the wrong format, and then we got another one showing that there was an error, and then we had the final updated version, and this has the whole form so this will actually shows it to you updated, even though the error hasn't gone away, because I said that the exception only gets fixed when you move state. But you see that basically we have a history of the different versions in the system. So if, for example, for legal reasons you need to keep history of all versions, that is available here. Now in logs, on the tab and log, we have all different changes that took place in this particular tax form. So we see, for example, that it was created in pending state. When a form version is created, we have it logged over here. The different movement to different statuses, and we'll look at the different life cycle of the registration form in a moment. We will be able to see that as well. We see that, for example, a to-do was created because an exception was formed. Now, and we haven't looked at to-dos, but that would we corrected the registration form without actually going to the to-do. But a to-do, again, is just an alert to the user to actually do something, and this tells me that it was suspended and what the reason, and it was closed because we fixed the exception immediately. Then it shows me the particular entities. When we moved to posting, it created a taxpayer, then it created an account and a tax roll. And the tax roll in itself created obligations. So we have a log of everything that happened on the registration form. Now, if I go to my registration form, so we see that we actually created the person, the account, tax roll, and I just show in gray that the tax roll itself created obligations for me. Now, just to highlight again the different life cycle of that registration form, what we see is the following. When we created the registration form, it started an initial status called pending, and then it moved to a state called validated. And at that step, we actually tested to see whether all the information was actually was added correctly. And after that, it moved to ready for posted step. And only if all the validation is passed does it move to validated. If it's suspended and we had an error, it moved to suspend state, and then it moved back to validated. And then moving to posted, then all the rules which create the taxpayer are run. Now, what does that mean by when I say that all the rules were run? Let me go back to the application and go to what is called the form type. And this is the form type underlying the form that we used. The two most important things to point out are the section list. Section list is actually shows you the particular sections that the form uses. So what I'm going to do, actually, so it can be clearer, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to go back to the registration form that we were on, and on a different tab over here, I'm going to open up that form type. So we can see it side by side to see how it works together. So we see over here we have 3 sections. These 3 sections correspond to the sections that I have down in my form type. 2 are only shown because the first one over here, the main, is standard and is always appears in the same format and it cannot be changed. But the taxpayer information, as we should remember, with all these different particular lines, corresponds to the lines that I see on my section list over here. So here, the form lines which I define here create this particular registration form with this particular lines, and similarly as well for the tax type as well. Now there's a lot of different configuration needed for each particular section and line. Just point out one thing that we saw before. If you remember, when we tried to check to see whether the form was created correctly, we had an alert saying the taxpayer info was not filled out. When we didn't fill this out, it was empty, it came up with an alert, and that was because we had a rule saying it's required. But when we didn't fill out the tax type, when we left this empty, it didn't error, and that's because it was set to be optional. So there are many things like that which are important to define the sections, and then the lines as well have all different types of rules. It tells me about what field I used to create the particular field. For example, tax type is a drop down, and it shows over here that I'm going to be using a date. This is for the effective date, and if I go back to the the tax type, it shows me that it's going to be a drop down is going to be created, and that's why we have a drop down here, and so on. So the form type is used to actually generate the look and feel of the form. And the other thing which I wanted to point out are the rules. The rules here show that for each particular rule event, post, validate, and so on, certain rules run, form rule group. And what we're saying here is that at the state of validate, what will happen is that we're going to check for certain lines will be filled out. In fact, it tells you that you need to have certain lines need to be filled out. The document locator number has to be a unique number. And we are checking to see whether the format was correct. In fact, this is the error which we got because when we checked to see whether the right format was used for the ID type, and it wasn't, so it errored on that step. And that runs when it moves to the validate step under the rule event. In the post, we created a taxpayer, an account, and a tax role, and that's because each one of these rules is responsible for doing one of those creation steps. Now, configuring a tax form is pretty complicated, and there's a whole class dedicated to actually teaching you tax form and registration form configuration. Here I just simply wanted to show you an overview of the fact that a form is related to its type, and the type is responsible for creating the user interface, the sections and lines, and also for creating the rules that run at each particular status. And I think that's sufficient to give you an overview of how this is configured.